So earlier this year, some of America's biggest comedians performed at the Saudi Arabian government-sponsored Ryiadh Comedy Festival, pissing off pretty much the entire English-speaking internet. The multi-week comedy show itself was a smashing success, selling out across 14 days with estimates of over 100,000 tickets sold. Online though, it was a complete different story. From journalists to influencers to fans, there was outrage over these comedians performing in what critics call a propaganda event for a government with widespread human rights abuses and alleged involvement in the 9/11 attacks. The Riyadh comics were labelled sellouts and hypocrites, happy to compromise on their morals for that fat, blood-soaked paycheck. In response, some comics dismissed the backlash as selective outrage or Islamophobia, saying that the US is just as bad. Others said they believed that they were promoting human rights by sharing liberal ideas through comedy. This did nothing but make things worse. Critics doubled down, and fans felt like they were being made fools of. The vast majority of the online community seems to agree that this is simply another case of greedy entertainers selling out. But I felt like this controversy was worth examining a bit closer. Did these comedians really deserve the level of backlash that they got? Or is this another example of Western double standards and selective outrage? Islamophobia? And could the festival have actually helped improve the human rights situation in Saudi, as some have suggested? Let's get to the bottom of it.
Riyadh, where you at?
Let's start by taking a look at the backlash and the main criticisms of the Riyadh Comedy Festival. I found that these arguments fall under one of three categories. Arguably, the main criticism of these comics is that they were taking money from an oppressive government with numerous human rights violations. Many accuse the Saudi government of using the comedy festival as a propaganda tool, a way to whitewash its image and distract from its abuses, and that these comics are profiting from it. So, what is this festival supposed to distract us from? One of the major human rights issues in Saudi Arabia is the suppression of free speech. We've seen multiple dissident journalists and political activists that have faced legal persecution and even executions for speaking or acting out against the Saudi kingdom. Khashoggi was a US-based Saudi dissident journalist that was assassinated in 2018, allegedly under the direct orders of Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi himself. Back in June this year, Turki Al Jazeera was executed for publishing corruption allegations against members of the Saudi royal family. Another big issue is women's rights. Saudi Arabia has long been associated with extreme gender inequality, and it's not too hard to see why. It hasn't been that long since women were legally required to have a male guardian to work or travel, had no legal protection from domestic violence, and restricted from many public spaces. Even after recent reforms, Saudi Arabia still has a ways to go legally and culturally. For instance, reports show that some male guardianship practices continue informally even if they're no longer enforced by law. That said, it's also true that women's rights reforms have led to real improvements. Women's workforce participation has more than doubled, jumping from 17% in 2010 to 36% at present. And Saudi Arabia even scored above average in the 2021 Women, Business and the Law Index. Slave labour is another issue that's been brought up a lot. What's being referred to isn't traditional slavery, but the widespread labour abuses faced by many migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. At the root of this problem was the kafala system, abolished just in October this year, which gave employers extensive control over foreign workers, making it extremely difficult to leave or change jobs without permission. Many powerless workers dealt with poor living facilities, dangerous working conditions, and wage theft. Recent estimates suggest around 740,000 workers face such conditions. That's over 5% of Saudi Arabia's 13.2 million total foreign workforce. Whether the new reforms will meaningfully improve this situation remains to be seen. Now that we've gone over some of the major human rights abuse claims, we can see that the human rights rhetoric in this controversy is largely justified. Entertainers taking money from governments with such poor human rights track records should raise questions. However, it's very common to see people paint a caricature of Saudi Arabia as an irredeemably backwards hellhole, sometimes with not so subtle racial undertones.
You headed to a place where they treating women maliciously, beating the bitches viciously, physically dominating hoes.
This ignores the real progress that's been made. Yes, you could argue that these reforms are not enough or cynically motivated, but the reality is there are tangible signs of change, such as improvements in women's rights, loosening of social restrictions, and the modernizing of its labor economy. Nonetheless, there's still substantial, well-documented evidence of serious ongoing human rights issues that do warrant concern and criticism. In particular, the heavy-handed suppression of free speech does not seem to be letting up anytime soon. Now, especially within the online community, I've noticed that the outrage isn't just about human rights. It's about hypocrisy and honesty. Progressive-leaning comedians such as Bill Burr and Jessica Kirson took the brunt of the backlash, accused of collaborating with a government that's essentially antithetical to their political views. Bill Burr, who's been outspoken about wealth inequality in America, has been accused of selling out given that he's performing in a country also marked by severe wealth disparity as well as widespread labor abuses. Jessica Kirson, a prominent LGBTQ comedian, was criticized for her participation given the host country's poor track record when it comes to the local LGBTQ community. It's hard to overstate just how upset the fans of these two comedians are at them. Personally, as someone that's not really a big fan of either comics, while I can understand why many see their actions as hypocritical, I think the outrage is slightly overblown, and I'll talk about why a bit later.
Weren't those the 9/11 guys? So I thought. Aren't they exactly the 9/11 guys?
I've seen this accusation being thrown around quite a bit, with these comics essentially being labelled as national traitors. Well, the official position as of now of both the US and Saudi governments is that Saudi had no state-level involvement in the 9/11 attacks. But we also know that during the period leading up to 9/11, there were many in Saudi that were sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization behind the attacks, with significant funding flowing from charities and private donors within the country. There's also been a growing pile of circumstantial evidence that's made many suspicious of their involvement in a state capacity. But while Saudi is looking very suspicious, the main trial is still ongoing, so we're just going to have to wait a little bit longer to see if state-level involvement is confirmed. At the same time, I understand that 9/11 was a deeply traumatic event for many Americans, and given some of the evidence that suggests potential Saudi involvement, I can see how American comedians performing at a Saudi government-backed event could be seen as being in poor taste. Alright, so we've looked at what the backlash was all about. Let's now go through some of the responses and justifications that the Ryiadh comics and their defenders have brought up and see whether they hold up.
It's just racism. I think it took me a second because when people are going like, oh, you're doing something unethical. I'm like, oh, these must be ethical people. Let me listen. And then you're like, oh no, you're just racist.
Essentially, it's the claim that people don't really care about human rights, they're just racist or Islamophobic. Now, to be fair, I'm sure racism towards Arabs and Muslims does fuel some of the hostility. But even with that in mind, the human rights critique in this case are still valid and very serious. So the "you're only mad because you're racist" defense doesn't really hold up under much scrutiny, especially when on its own as presented by Whitney Cummings. A more substantial justification for the Riyadh Comedy Festival is that it helped promote human rights within Saudi Arabia. Even some of the harshest critics admit there are benefits to this kind of cultural exchange. But they all insist that because the event was funded by the Saudi government and has propaganda potential, any good it might do is invalidated or massively outweighed by the harm. So, the real question is this: can a comedy festival meaningfully contribute to positive social change in Saudi Arabia, even if it's simultaneously being used as propaganda? Yes, and in this case, the benefits likely outweigh the negatives associated with its propaganda potential. Let's zoom out for a second and see why culture is so important to advancing human rights in Saudi Arabia at its current stage in development. Online discourse often paints a picture of Saudi citizens as people coerced into submission on dress codes, gender roles, and speech restrictions by oppressive laws and policies. But that's not the whole picture. Many of the laws that Western observers view as oppressive are also grounded in cultural norms. Take women's rights. The fact that certain guardianship practices remain despite legal reforms and the comparatively low turnout of women in local elections since being allowed to participate show how ineffective legal reforms can be without cultural change. Women's autonomy isn't just restricted by laws, but also cultural norms that are held by Saudi men and women. For instance, in an opinion poll, only 40% of women said they believe that women should be equally represented in policy-making decisions. On freedom of speech, surveys show similar nuance. Only around a quarter of Saudi respondents believe people should be free to publicly criticize government policies. From this, we can infer a degree of passive, and in some cases active, support for heavy-handed measures against activists or journalists when framed as necessary for national security or stability. Compared to Western norms, there is a far stronger cultural prioritization of public order and economic growth over unrestricted expression. Saudi Arabia is far from a liberal democracy, but even in more authoritarian countries, government policies are shaped by public opinion. Shifting cultural attitudes can encourage or even compel legal reform. Conversely, reforms imposed without cultural change often spark backlash or prove ineffective. From this perspective, it's clear how avenues for cultural exchange can play an important role in human rights progress in Saudi Arabia. Jessica Kirson shared that as one of the first openly gay comics to speak about her sexuality on stage in Saudi Arabia, she received messages from attendees expressing how meaningful it was to see that representation. It's not hard to imagine the impact such a moment could have on the local LGBTQ community. To witness an openly gay performer not only appear at a state-sponsored comedy festival, but also address her identity openly. Of course, no one's convinced that the Saudi government is now a benevolent champion of the LGBTQ community. Yet, even the most skeptical observer must acknowledge that this is a significant milestone in the normalization of LGBTQ in Saudi society. Whitney Cummings, though not necessarily the leading feminist voice, may nonetheless have had a positive impact simply through her presence and success. For Saudi Arabians, seeing a woman in a confident, public, and unapologetically outspoken role can help normalize the idea of women occupying positions of power and visibility. Same thing with freedom of speech. Stand-up comedy is a form of entertainment where political and social critique are major elements. Pushing boundaries is what comics aim to do. So, promoting such a genre of entertainment on an unprecedented scale is a good thing in terms of promoting freedom of expression. Okay, so we've looked at how the Ryiadh Comedy Festival helped contribute to positive social change inside Saudi Arabia. But what about how it whitewashes Saudi Arabia's human rights violations? First, let's clarify some things. Despite the dominant narrative online, Saudi Arabia's motivation for holding this comedy festival was most likely not to persuade the opinions of us Westerners. At least, I doubt it's the main motive. Firstly, why would they even want to change our opinions of them? Even with their terrible public image in the West, the Saudis already get everything they actually want from us. Also, anytime Saudi Arabia, or any Gulf state, has tried so-called sports washing, art washing, music washing, and now laugh washing, it's actually drawn more attention to their worst abuses. These initiatives cost billions, and the global backlash is always loud. Saudi officials absolutely know the ROI on this kind of propaganda is terrible. So why are Saudis pouring so much money into Western cultural industries? Well, the most likely reason is economic. You've got a massive, young population that's extremely online, extremely globalized, speak English, and that's been historically deprived of entertainment options we take for granted in the West. And when you look at the ridiculous success of these shows, the Ryiadh Comedy Festival rivaled some of the biggest American comedy events, it's clear the local demand is enormous. Basically, propaganda was likely not the main motive for the event, and even if it was, the impact was never going to be very high. What I'm saying is, with the Ryiadh Comedy Festival, the benefits from cultural exchange in furthering social progress in Saudi Arabia outweighs the propaganda downsides. This ties back to the hypocrisy criticisms. Let's use Jessica Kirson as an example. Collaborating with a government that's oppressive towards LGBTQ people can seem hypocritical, sure. But if events like this contributes to a more open cultural environment that ultimately benefits Saudi LGBTQ people, the moral judgment isn't so clear-cut. This is not to argue that all or any of the Riyadh comedians did the show out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm sure many of them couldn't care less.
I get the routing and then I see the number and I go, I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, you know.
But I want to emphasize that this does not negate the real benefits that can come from such an event. I've seen this argument here and there online. The US has committed more human rights violations than Saudi Arabia, so why are we so outraged about Riyadh, but not when comedians perform in the US? Well, the US provides far stronger legal and practical rights protections for its population than Saudi Arabia, especially in areas of free expression, gender equality, and labor rights. But if we look from a global and historical perspective, it's a complete different story. Forget genocide of Native Americans and slavery. To really drive home this point, let's just start from 1932, the year Saudi Arabia was founded, and roughly estimate and compare the victims of state-perpetrated human rights atrocities of the two countries. I mean, guys, It's not even close. From civilian bombing campaigns in Asia, to drone strikes across the Middle East and Africa, to complicity, intelligence, and financial support of genocides in Indonesia and now currently in Gaza, to starving of entire populations through economic sanctions, the American count dwarfs the Saudis. Even Saudi's worst atrocity in Yemen was only possible through American weapons, American intelligence, American logistics, and American diplomatic cover. And this brings us to another important point. The depth of the US-Saudi partnership on political, military, and economic dimensions means that the US also bears at least partial responsibility for many of Saudi Arabia's human rights violations that many Americans would like to disassociate from. In other words, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, it's American money that should be considered
the bloodiest money on the planet,
not Saudi Arabia's, as Mark Maron claims. These American comics that are being criticized for taking Saudi blood money has taken far more American blood money, which is far bloodier. You could say though that the difference lies in the fact that it was government sponsored and thus had a propaganda effect. I've already talked about the limitations of the propaganda argument, but more importantly, while the link between money and human rights abuses may be shorter in the case of the Ryiadh Comedy Festival than that of ordinary American economic activity, it's no less real. And when considering the bloodiness of American money and how much more of it these comics have received compared to the Saudis, is it really a meaningful moral line? From this perspective, it makes the moral distinction between performing in the US and performing at the Ryiadh Comedy Festival far less stark than the backlash suggests. That said, this does not invalidate criticisms of Saudi Arabia or the Ryiadh Comedy Festival. Instead, it highlights an instance of selective outrage. Western progressives who openly acknowledge the US's terrible human rights record still tend to place Saudi Arabia on some uniquely evil moral category, while the US is a good country that sometimes makes mistakes. Even though, when you look at the global scale, the number of victims caused by US actions far outstrips Saudi Arabia's. The criticisms of the Riyadh Comedy Festival are not baseless. Saudi Arabia's ongoing human rights challenges, particularly regarding free speech, women's rights, and labor practices, remain serious and deserve attention. American entertainers with immense cultural influence should rightly be scrutinized when collaborating with governments that violate human rights. That said, my three core issues with the backlash are: Number 1. A portrayal of Saudi Arabia and its people as incapable of progress, dismissing real improvements in the country. 2. Failure to acknowledge the critical benefits of cultural exchange while overstating the propaganda effects of the comedy festival. And 3. A dominant and unquestioned assumption of moral superiority of the US and the West in general over Saudi Arabia. To conclude, I want to say that as we continue to rightfully call out entertainers on their BS, we should be mindful not to shut down avenues for cultural exchange that can contribute to social progress, even in morally complicated contexts such as the Riyadh Comedy Festival.